get you warmed up, and then we'll turn this over to Jamarl. We'll want to make sure that you know that through the 30th, Dr. Quaker is going to be supporting us with the monthly earnings, so I love them. On any case, this is purely an aside, but it's a place you can take your gently used goods to and give them new homes. What they do is display them for people, and then people electively decide if they want to take that item home. It's kind of a nifty system. It's called the thrift store, and they're on the corner of Coalfield and Route 60, also called the Midlothian Turnpike. And anyway, they're a great place to turn over goods that you don't need anymore. So there you go. And I'm going to turn this over to Jamarl now, after reminding you that this is WRWK LPFM 93.9, the Work FM, serving Chesterfield, Henrico, Richmond, Goochland, Hanover, and the entire universe if they have internet. So, without further ado, here is the man of the hour.
Let's try this one more time. I was trying to do the intro. I'm not hearing it.
Oh, yes, okay.
Man of the hour, right? Right? We good? I hope you guys are doing all right. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I will be the voice in your ear for the next 2 hours. This is the Radio Hour. I am here every Tuesday. I want to thank my operator for Ron. I always give him a hard time sometime, but thank you.
Not at all.
Yeah, guys, I hope you guys have had a really good day today. I mean, this has been not too bad of a day. Snowy and cold here in Richmond, Virginia. Yesterday, it was gorgeous, relatively so, considering November. Today, snowing, turning to ice. That is cooled off, however. I hope you guys have made it safe to work and safe back home. I want to give a shout out to Amazon. Amazon in Seattle greatly disliked the government that was in Seattle, and Amazon spent $4 million in order to reshape the district in Seattle, Washington. Specifically, Sharma Shawant, where they spent $1.5 million to get rid of her. Her crime, and the thing that Amazon disliked about her, she's the socialist in that particular district, and she's worked to increase wages. She's also worked in order to get a head tax in order to remove homelessness in Seattle, something that they have a major problem on. They disliked her, and they were trying to spend their cash in order to reshape what that district looked like. Amazon lost. Amazon lost. Now, my shout out to Amazon is because this is just a funny loss. And they gave me a chuckle when I heard that they essentially blew $4 million and could have burned it on the lawn. The wild part about this is, instead of Amazon using that money to get rid of homelessness, or instead of Amazon using that money in the sense of a head tax so the state can get rid of homelessness, Amazon thought it was a better investment to just buy candidates. Hey, if we buy this guy, it would do two things. A, they would enact our agenda because, after all, we just bought them. But beyond that, it would put a psychological thing in the minds of the various people who are in Seattle. Don't screw with Amazon if you want to keep your job. Well, fortunately, this failed. I kind of also want to make a secondary point from the standpoint of the Democratic Party and the politics that the Democratic Party has ran with. The Democratic Party has taken the perspective, especially going all the way back to Clinton, that cash is the most important thing on the planet, and you must get that cash if you're ever to win an election. And because you need the cash, and the people who are giving you that cash have certain perspectives of the world, especially from the standpoint of politics and their agenda getting accomplished, that the only thing you can do in order to receive that cash is to work around the edges. Incrementalism. To be least worse than the other party that is absolutely horrible. Now, understand what this means, though. This is somewhat of a Faustian bargain, right? The left, at least what we consider to be the left, wasn't ever going to get ends like that. They were never going to get money like that. What the left had mostly was labor, was essentially bodies, things that could go and protest, things that can go and send organs that can go and get people out to the polls, to get workers to the polls, to get workers informed about the issues that are taking place. The muscle was always the thing that the left had. I always say you have dollars or you have pitchforks. And for the longest time in our political space, you've only had dollars. And unfortunately, those dollars were going to both parties. Sharma Shawant, and by the way, not just her, the other Congress members on that in that district, proved that to be wrong. It proves it to be wrong. The fact that Sanders is able to get these people in these stadiums, the guy who's not taking corporate money, has never taken corporate money in this sense, is able to get buku's amounts of cash from people, workers, the poor, throughout the country itself, and to get more of it than anybody else in the race, including people who have been doing big ticket donations and will be getting all of the super PAC money and everything else. It proves the model wrong. I'm not saying it doesn't take more work. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that it doesn't take people getting out and being involved, and for you as a particular political leader, for people to believe that you're going to do what you say you're going to do, and for you to, for the most part, give a vision and an area and direction of where the country is going, or at the very least where you want the country to go. And more importantly, for the people to believe that you actually mean it. You can get into a mic and scream hope and change. And you can be a good political figure, and you can also trick the public into supporting you with this notion of hope and change, but you can also mean it. You can also mean it. And when people believe that you mean it, in spite of the massive amounts of cash that would be availed against you because you do indeed mean it, you can still succeed. This is an outlier, believe it or not. 90% of the races in the United States are won by the side with the most cash. Think about what I just said to you. This is true. Washington Post reports it. 90% of the elections in the United States is determined by the side with the most cash. If you're a logical person, a rational human being, and you're in the political space, even if you were a tick to the left, even if you wanted to do big things or expansive things, even if you had all these hopes and dreams and everything else, and you learn as you get into the political space as a congressman that 70% of your time is begging for cash, which is also true, and that 90% of the elections are won by the side with the most cash, which is also true. What are you, as a rational human being, to do in this situation? What I suggest to you is what our political space has become. You lean to the side that is going to give you the cash. There are elements of this on the left, there are elements of this on the right, but they, for the most part, equal to the same thing. You lean to the side with the most cash. And within the context of you getting that cash, you think about the areas that you can do incremental work. And you have to convince your public that is going to vote for you that this is okay. If you're on the right, then there is not that much of an issue here. I mean, ultimately, you can make that pitch. You can scream America and freedom and all this other stuff. Many members of the right vote for other reasons other than economics. Lower my taxes is an effective argument if you are on the right. Now, many of the right are dirt poor, and they fall into this line of reasoning for various reasons. But the left has the contradiction, right? I mean, ultimately, it is the Democratic Party that is supposed to be the blunt edge against the capitalistic system. It is supposed to be the thing that holds back the night, the man on the wall against capitalistic expansion. All hail the 1% and their unaccountable wealth. Here's the thing. That is not what the party has been doing. And instead, they give this FDR-type shtick without necessarily living up to the items of FDR. Look at the reaction to Sanders for the moment. Ultimately, you've had 22 people in this race. And with 22 people in the race, you've seen a surge of Sanders since the heart attack. It's like he's bolting out of the grave of sorts. New Hampshire, Iowa, national polling against Trump, you've seen a significant bump, especially with the endorsements of AOC, Ilhan, and the gentleman, I think his name is Stacy something, in Iowa. The nurses union has just come out supporting Sanders also. He's been getting a bump. What has been the response of the Democratic Party? If you've noticed, the articles that's been coming out of the New York Times, essentially anybody but Sanders, they asked the question, is there anybody else? There are 22 people in this race. What's his name? Bloomberg, a billionaire, is getting into the race now. And not just Bloomberg, they're talking about Devon Patrick potentially getting into the race. 2 additional entrants getting into the Democratic Party race that already had 22 people in the race. As if the perspectives of the people getting in the race is not already enumerated by the people in the race. It's astonishing. They're freaked out. For the first time, they found a resurgence of the left. People like AOC are not taking campaign donations from the billionaire class. Sanders is not taking those things from the billionaire class. And even when they're talking about Warren, I don't necessarily think they trust Warren all that much, even though Warren is not entirely trusted on the left. They're looking for somebody else. Bloomberg's entry into the race is not because he doesn't think that anybody else in the race can beat Trump. They think Biden is fading, and they're freaked out about the rise of Sanders, someone who is very clear that he thinks billionaires shouldn't exist, and he has told a line outright, singing in the day, no hedge, that he is a democratic socialist. He's very clear on what he believes, and for the most part, they've always told us that this was impossible to do, and yet he's doing it. He's breaking the model, and in breaking the model, the billionaire class, the class of wealth, the oligarchs that are in this country are freaked out by it. Sharma Shawant is just one example of this. Ultimately, their issue is we can't find somebody who we think can win that is not Bernie Sanders. Let's be very clear that this is more the issue than anything else. They find Sanders to be an existential threat. And I would even argue what Warren is saying to them, they consider to be a loss. This is a fascinating era in our American politics. It really is. And for the first time, you've seen a party that has imploded. They lost the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, didn't even fight for the Supreme Court pick. Merrick Garland, who was milquetoast at best and was a guy Republicans would have been okay with under normal circumstances. And the presidency to reality show hosts. Not to mention 1,100 seats all throughout the United States. That's called a loss of legitimacy, a loss of credibility, especially in order to defend the elements of this country against a right wing that has been more rabid than has ever been in our history. I put to you that part of the reason they're that rabid is because Democrats have ceded so much ground by this Faustian bargain of taking cash and doing policy favors, be it tax cuts or, for that matter, just outright trade deals. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was an outright betrayal of the working class. And despite Hillary's, who supported it, trying to get away from it, Obama still kept banging that hammer in spite of what it was going to do. He was going to give up the sovereignty of this nation to a plutocratic class that would have been unaccountable and would have superseded our laws. That wouldn't happen under Sanders. It wouldn't even be considered. And I guess that's the issue, right? This notion that we have been able to keep both parties under corporate capture for 40 years. And now this resurgence. And I would put to you that the resurgence is the direct result of environmental factors. It's not magic. You've taken and sucked 95% of the wealth and given it to the top 1%. And that was under a guy that was screaming hope and change. When issues like Flint came up and Obama got on stage and drunk the water, acted as if there was nothing wrong and it chummed it up with Snyder. That is an outright betrayal. When he threw his bodies on the bankers in order to protect them from the mob and yet let the homeowners go bust, that was an outright betrayal. 0.1% of the population, the richest 0.1%, owns more wealth than the bottom 90%. Think about that. You're talking about the workers, the people who make your society run. I mean, look out your window. The fact that you don't have mobs roving the streets is a testament to the society itself. The fact that the streets are paved, no, they're not perfect, but they're paved. The fact that you have people who will fix the electricity. The guy who comes in and cleans your plumber. The person who serves you your coffee, who pours your drink, who serves you your food. I'm talking about all the elements of this particular society and the people in this society that make this society run. And of that, the 0.1% sucks up that much wealth. Is that fair? Is that fair? You can step back from a system and ask yourself, is it fair? I mean, ultimately, our rules set and the way that we organize ourselves and the way that we think about our world are ultimately determined by the society to which we grow up in. It is not something separate and distinct from the society. Your point of view, whether you agree with our world or you don't agree with that world, you're still responding to the world. These are environmental factors. If you grew up in feudal Japan, you would have a different perspective and a different level of politics than you do now. You are a testament to the environment to which you have grown up in. I say that because I'm bringing up this notion about what's fair in the sense of earnings and in the sense of the distribution of wealth in this country. Jeff Bezos has $150 billion. Bill Gates has $110 billion. And even when you talk about the Walton family, what, $50 billion? In order to get $1 billion, if I gave you $1, every 10 seconds, it would take you 4 months to become a millionaire. If I gave you the same quantity, it would take you over 300 years to become a billionaire. Think about that. We're talking about an ungodly amount of wealth. And when you put it in real terms, regardless of the idea that Bezos had, or the idea that Bill Gates had, or the idea that the Waltons had, at the end of the day, they could go to the bank, they could get the money, and they would be sitting in a warehouse. Without your labor, or you buying their products, it would be impossible for their idea to go anywhere. And yet, we accept in this country that 95% of the income gains go to the top 1%, and that it is just and right for a very small portion to suck up and expropriate the wealth. It is impossible for Walmart to exist without people buying their products or shopping at their stores. It is impossible for Bezos' idea to come about without a society that would allow it, without the technology that this government, in many respects, paid for. The same thing is true for Gates. Should an idea give infinite compensation, especially when that idea is impossible to do anything with without you or I working or shopping in order to make that become a reality? Is it fair? And if it's not fair, should we not organize our workplaces in a way where that money doesn't get distributed entirely to the top, or mainly to the top? Should we not organize our workplaces that are more democratic, where one person or one small body of people make the decisions on what happened to everybody else within the context of the company? Should workers have more agency in their jobs, considering it is crucial, they are a necessary component for that wealth to ever be made in the first place? I think that is true. That is an ideological disposition, but it's an ideological disposition that I would argue, from a class standpoint, makes all the sense in the world if you're part of the 99 or even 95% of the population. Why on earth would you take a perspective that is dominated and in the best interest of the 1%? You have a president who's supposedly a billionaire. I don't quite believe it. You have Bloomberg, who's getting into the race, the 1% that's going to save the world and save the Democratic Party from what I don't know. And you have another billionaire in the race, Tom Steyer, who bought his way into the race and got caught trying to buy an endorsement. When I make the point to you that this is an oligarchic society, I show you in the sense of this is your country. And just be aware, no society that's an oligarchical society will run itself nakedly. Certainly, they would also use the terms of freedom and democracy, just like in Hunger Games. Freedom, democracy, free press, this press is objective, etc., etc. Nonsense. Look at your world. Look at the candidates who are running. And interestingly enough, if you look at the vote totals from the standpoint of a Sanders and a Warren, now I don't trust Warren as far as I can throw Warren, but at the very least she has ran to try to be a cuddler version of Sanders and has been aping his position. So even from the standpoint of the optics, you have two people in the race that, if you combine their totals, will be winning this race handedly, and a billionaire class that no longer trusts the Democratic Party to toe their line. This is WRWK, The Work, 93.9 FM.
Network.
That's my point. That's why she was doing it. All right, guys, we're back. This is WRWK 93.9 FM, The Work. I want to talk about polling. I like polling. Not everybody, for the most part, you can't necessarily trust each and every poll that comes out, but I do think there's certain trends that come on in polling that kind of gets across what the public is thinking about, where their mind is. One of the recent things that we've been seeing has been a bump in Sanders and some of the various polling. Up 5, and I think it was Wall Street Journal and the New York Times poll, don't quote me on that one, and the Monmouth poll and okay, don't quote me on those, but he's been up 5 and up 2 in the various polls, with a weird quirk that Warren has frozen. So Nate Silver comes out and says, after essentially that last debate, especially since you've been seeing a research or a surgence of Pete Buttigieg, who I still say is not a real thing, you've seen Biden leading in most of the overwhelming majority of those polling. When beforehand, that wasn't necessarily true when Warren was getting her surge. Have we seen peak Warren? Now, I put to you that in the very next debate, one of the things that you're going to see is Warren to be attacked ferociously on her Medicare for All plan. The problem with the Medicare for All plan, and there are a few, but mainly she made this argument and she got stuck in this argument of taxes for the middle class won't go up. Now, beforehand, I've argued that Warren's perspective on this and the argument that she's made for Medicare for All, even though I don't necessarily buy that she was for it, was on point. Her and Sanders on that debate stage were able to argue together on the same plan against many of the candidates. Because what it made it look like is you have two people in a foxhole arguing for Medicare for All, where everybody else has something else and pretending to get as close to Medicare for All with it not being Medicare for All. I mean, for God's sake, Andrew Yang has come out and said that, yes, I'm going to call it Medicare for All, even though it's not Medicare for All and all. It's not even single payer. And when the reporter asks him, are you being disingenuous about this? Well, I mean, we tell people at some point. Like, they've been trying to copy the name without the substance. Warren's argument, especially in the first two debates, was so on point. And the attacks on Medicare for All only strengthened it. It strengthened their arguments. Their arguments got sharper. Their ability to argue and debate it got that much better. And I find that to be one of the things that debates and primaries are for. You want to make sure that your candidate doesn't have a glass jaw. And the debates and the arguments that these guys were pushing for, you want to make sure that those things are solid, especially before you go into a general where all bets are off in regards to what attacks will be leveled against you. Well, I think the Medicare for All thing has been to the best. That stops now. Because at this point, she has not been to the best. The argument in putting out the budget for single payer in order to try to get rid of this notion that the middle class gets a tax increase. Here's the thing, and Warren was right the first time around that she was arguing this. The middle class tax increase doesn't matter. What matters is savings. If you are bringing home a lot more in your paycheck and you have a modest increase in taxes and all of your medical bills go away, all of your point of service bills go away, you've made off to the betterment by thousands of dollars. Like, it's hard to get that across. Two economists came out, I believe they were from Berkeley, and made the argument that this would be the largest income increase for a generation. Because understand, your medical bills and the way that you pay those bills are a regressive tax. You don't have choice of your health care. Your company, and every company that I've been in, chooses what is in their best interest, and the healthcare company make choices about what is in their financial best interest. And you, the last guy on the totem pole, maybe get a choice between one or two companies, but that's not really a choice. Nor do you have the option of opting out of healthcare at all, especially since Obama did something that he said he wasn't going to do in the primary, which was force people to get it, to compel people as a king to get healthcare as opposed to supplying it. It's not your choice. 500,000 people a year go bankrupt. Think about that. 500,000 a year due to medical bills or related to medical bills. There was a recent study that just came out that showed that 35 million people in this country knew somebody that died because they couldn't get medical treatment or relating to not being able to get medical treatment out of cost issues. That's extraordinary. This is the richest country in the history of the world. And we have people who are dying without health care. Why is that right? And can we not, as a nation, as a collective nation, come together and make a choice and how to resolve and solve this issue? Especially from the standpoint of a progressive tax. If healthcare is indeed a tax, which it is, and you're going to get taxed anyway, which you will, isn't it better to pay it in a progressive way that cuts your costs while having those who can afford to pay more to do so? That's basically the Medicare for All plan. Now, coming out and saying that the middle class won't pay extra is an extra step that was unnecessary. And it was one that is going to allow her to get attacked as Biden and many of the other Democrats pick apart her plan. And that's kind of the fault and the problem. When Warren was chastised for being a Native American, what did she do? She went out and got a blood test. Massively unnecessary to do. And the blood test essentially said she has as much Native American in her as my dog Pitsu. And now, when being chastised by the other elements on the stage, oh, this plan, how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? Sanders said he's not going to raise taxes. You said, Sanders says he's going to raise taxes on the middle class. You're saying that you're not. And now she comes out with a healthcare plan that can actually be attacked. It's a showpiece. There's no chance of passing. And that's kind of the problem. If she would have stayed with this notion that, yes, the middle class taxes will increase under Medicare for All plan, at the very least, her and Sanders could have fought that in a foxhole way of dealing with the issue. And that is somewhat of a sustainable perspective. Now, they've been able to divvy them up and create distinction and difference between Sanders' plan, who says, honestly, yes, there will be a modest increase in costs for the middle class from the standpoint of taxes. However, their other expenses go away and the amount that they pay will dramatically go down. He's being honest, is what they would say. You aren't. Why aren't you telling us the truth? That's going to be the attack point on the Democratic debate stage. And I think she might have did herself a disservice in breaking away from that. And I say this as somebody who thought her argument on this was just as good, if not better than Sanders, at the very least in the first debate. This will be problematic. Another person who's not doing all that great in the polls is one Kamala Harris. A new poll is out from Quinnipiac. Quinnipiac doesn't necessarily do polls in New Hampshire per se. This is their first poll. But a new poll is out in Quinnipiac that is drawing attention and drawing some eyes. Listen to this. Remember this moment. Back, I think this was several months ago when the debate first started and Kamala Harris was considered a frontrunner.
I want to bring the conversation back to the broken criminal justice system that is disproportionately negatively impacting Black and brown people all across this country today. Now, Senator Harris says she's proud of her record as a prosecutor and that she'll be a prosecutor president, but I'm deeply concerned about this record. There are too many examples to cite, but she put over 1,500 people in jail for marijuana violations and then laughed about it when she was asked if she ever smoked marijuana. She blocked evidence. That would have freed an innocent man from death row until the courts forced her to do so. She kept people in prison beyond their sentences to use them as cheap labor for the state of California. And she fought to keep cash bail system in place that impacts poor people in the worst kind of way.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Senator Harris, your response.
Now, before we get to Kamala Harris's response, there's been a lot that has been thrown at her in like 60 seconds. And especially if you're from the left, this is just this is devastating. The lefties tend to be okay with pot, and many of them smoked. And to be honest, 70% of the public have smoked pot. But the lefties tend to be extraordinarily strong on this point of pot should be legalized. So if you've been putting people in prison for this doesn't sit well, even if it's accepted that you're a prosecutor. The thing about keeping a man in prison on death row is brutal. And you need to answer for that. Meaning, and she didn't even get into truancy violations. I mean, Kamala Harris at one point was giggling like nobody's business, talking about keeping a woman homeless, by the way. They had 2 kids, threatening that woman with jail if she couldn't keep her kids in school, as if the issue with her wasn't keeping the kids in school and not the fact that she was homeless. Kamala Harris has problems with her record. This doesn't get into Steve Mnuchin. This doesn't get into the keeping a man or having people pay, 8 cents away from slavery to fight fires, despite the state of California saying let the people out of jail. Like, Kamala Harris has some serious issues with her record. But right now, she has the spotlight. She has the stage. God himself is silent as he waits for Kamala Harris to give her response. But you have to give a response. You have to explain some of that, if not all of that. Kamala Harris's response is such.
As the elected Attorney General of California, I did the work of significantly reforming the criminal justice system of a state of 40 million people, which became a national model for the work that needs to be done. And I am proud of that work. And I am proud of making a decision to not just give fancy speeches or be in a legislative body and give speeches on the floor, but actually doing the work of being in the position to use the power that I had to reform a system that is badly in need of reform.
Now, that's not an answer. That's not an answer. Somebody telling you kept a man in prison that you knew was innocent, and the judge had to force you to let an innocent man off death row. Now, that's not an answer. Saying I'm proud of that. Why are you proud of that? She named some very specific things that you did that were outright onerous, especially from the standpoint of the left. And your response basically is, I'm proud of my record. Anderson Cooper has Kamala Harris sitting here. And Anderson Cooper, reporter, you would think the most rational thing in the world would be, is there anything else you want to say in response to what Tulsi Gabbard said to defend your record? I mean, the keeping a man on death row sounds pretty bad. Would you like to respond further to that? That seems to be the most natural thing in the world, seeing as she had no response when she was on the debate stage. But we do not have reporters like that. And Anderson Cooper is a showpiece, not a journalist per se. Listen to Kamala Harris' response. He's asking her questions, essentially, basically, what do you have to say about that? Like, do you have anything to say about Harris? About Gabbard and this particular line of attack? Let's hear Kamala Harris' response. I have a point to this. Let's hear her response.
Did you expect that from Tulsi Gabbard? Had you had interaction about that in the past? And how do you think it went?
Well, I mean, listen, this is going to sound
How do you think it How do you think it went? All right, let's hear it.
modest, but I'm obviously a top-tier candidate, and so I did expect that I would be on the stage and take hits tonight because there are a lot of people that are trying to make the stage for the next debate.
Right. Yeah, for a lot of them, it's do or die.
Well, yeah, and especially when people are at 0 or 1% or whatever she might be at. And so I did expect that I might take hits tonight. But, listen, I think that this...
All right, you heard her. I expected to take hits. I assumed people were going to have a go at me. They're going to have a shot at the crown. I'm obviously a top-tier candidate. And as such, I expected the people to go after me because I was indeed a top-tier candidate. If you remember, after the first debate, Kamala Harris was riding high. I mean, she was considered a dark horse in this race. Had nothing to do with the race, but more so a potential to actually win that wasn't necessarily considered a front runner in the beginning. after she took a piece out of Joe Biden, trying to get the black vote and carve it out of Joe Biden, she popped up in the polls. If you remember, the immediate polls after the first debate had Kamala Harris in the third and fourth spot in many of those polls. And when you read into the polls, they said something phenomenal. She seems presidential. They don't know her from a hole in the wall. The only thing they have is that first debate. And they come away with, she seemed presidential. What do you think happened after that second debate when this balloon deflated and Tulsi Gabbard ended her? I've dubbed Tulsi Gabbard the career ender, or at the very least, the candidate ender, because of that 30-second bombshell that Kamala Harris was completely incapable of dealing with. And understand why that was so damaging. Kamala Harris's credibility, everything that people knew about her, for all intents and purposes, was in that first debate and the way she went after Joe Biden. Meaning that the debate framed her. Well, the second debate has just as much ability to frame an individual of who that person is. And it did. The most interesting thing in the world is Kamala Harris brings up, well, look, I'm obviously a top-tier candidate, and Tulsi Gabbard is, she's nowhere in the picture. This is out of New Hampshire. Gabbard is at 6%. Where do you think Kamala Harris is? Kamala Harris is at 1%. She is deflated. She has been in single digits all across everywhere. And she has been shutting down her polling location, shutting down her campaign in some areas because she has been hemorrhaging cash, including in New Hampshire. She has 1% in New Hampshire. Gabbard has 6 points in New Hampshire. And between the two, if we're looking at tiers of candidates, the person with 1% can't really, thumb their nose at the guy with 6. This is an outright, complete implosion by the Kamala Harris's campaign. And there's a certain degree of funny irony in her attacking Gabbard as not being a top-tier candidate, but she is popping her collar. Fast forward to a month or 2 months, and you have her scrounging around the bottom at 1% support. This is amazing implosion. Amazing implosion. On the secondary point, in this particular poll, Biden is at 20%, Sanders is at 14%, Warren is at 16%, and Buttigieg is at 15%. Now, I've made the point that Buttigieg is not really a thing. As much as the media wants to make him a thing, that's somewhat gaslighting. Iowa is a caucus state, so Iowa's a little bit weird in the way they organize themselves. People want to win in Iowa, so don't misunderstand me, but it's a caucus state. New Hampshire, also a smaller state. But the catch here is, Iowa and New Hampshire are predominantly, over the top, white. That's not good or bad, it just is. And the demographic that Pete is getting just so happens to be predominantly, over the top, white. Same thing with Warren. The educated liberal class that tends to be doing relatively okay loves these two. The wild part about this is, though, that when Pete Buttigieg can't get the black vote. Understand why that's important and why that's significant, especially when you're going to places in the South. I mean, ultimately, Buttigieg gets 3 or 4% of the black vote. It's obscenely low. I mean, I think Trump gets more or around the same amount. You can't win a primary like that. Ask Sanders. Sanders found that out the hard way when Clinton was out there kissing black babies and guzzling hot sauce. She understood. Sanders, in this election, understands. African Americans vote to the tune of around 90%, to my chagrin, in the Democratic Party. And it's not so much that I want them to vote in the Republican Party, it's just that I realize they lose their leverage in the political space when you're giving that much of your support, unquestioningly, to a particular party. In voting that much, they have somewhat of an influence. You may even call outsize in regards to the way candidates try to get their support and their attention. Joe Biden gets the support in spades, but that's not necessarily because they love Joe Biden. They just know Joe Biden and they believe he's more electable. You must understand, from the African American perspective, You don't have two parties. You have one party. And the question becomes, who keeps the monsters at bay? The issue with Buttigieg is not that African Americans are homophobic. That's utter nonsense. It's more so that they don't believe he can win. They believe Biden is somewhat of a safe bet that can keep the monsters at bay. When you're looking at the choices that African Americans make, especially in these primaries, if you look back at the Obama-Clinton, they didn't go to Obama immediately. They went to Clinton immediately. It was only when they thought Obama could win that the support shifted. Buttigieg is not getting that support, not because he's gay. It has nothing to do with him being gay. It's not that I don't doubt that there are some African Americans that may be homophobic, just like there are people of every race that are homophobic. It's more so that in this very specific context, you have other people in the race who are just better candidates and are better suited to win this race. Even Warren. Her support among African Americans is not stellar, but it's not in the toilet either, like Buttigieg. I guess I'm making the point that Buttigieg is not a thing. I could be wrong on this. I've been wrong on things before. And he may do well in Iowa and New Hampshire. But I would have to see him with a certain degree of longevity that goes beyond the two whitest states, especially since his popularity, when you're looking at the polling, is predominantly singularly among whites. Another interesting thing in this poll goes towards the level of support for the various candidates and who the candidates trust. When people ask who was more honest, that ended up being Sanders. When people ask who do they think cares about them more, that issue ended up being Sanders. But again, who you trust more and who you care about more matters less than who's more electable. And this is where Joe Biden gets somewhat of an edge. Even now, and I am shocked by this, Joe Biden has had longevity. I'm stunned by this. My thought was that there was no way Joe Biden can make it through a Democratic primary that's this far to the left and where he is essentially as a dinosaur. But I've been somewhat wrong on this. It's not that I think Joe Biden is going to make it through the primary. I don't. It's more so that he's had more longevity than I've thought he was going to have. And that the things that I thought was going to trip him up didn't. But that's, again, that could change. The reason I say that is people don't love Joe Biden. It's not love. Ultimately, it's the same question that African Americans have, but more so spread out over the entire Democratic Party. Who will get the monster out of the White House? Who keeps the monsters at bay? And many Democrats, especially people who are not entirely paying attention to the gaffes or the mental glimpses or just even the policy positions, fall on that notion of, I think he's more electable. I think he can beat the monster. He can get the monster at bay. The problem for Joe Biden is if that argument starts to fold, he doesn't have anything else to fall back on. Meaning, the moment that you can make an argument that a candidate that has vision, that has things that he wants to accomplish, that you know he means it, that you know he's honest, or for that matter, she, the electability argument starts to shrivel up and Joe Biden starts to fail. And I think what you're seeing in the various states with Joe Biden not having enough money, with Joe Biden losing cash, and with Joe Biden losing on the various states. I mean, this is Iowa, this is a New Hampshire poll, but Joe Biden had fallen to number 4 in Iowa. This is supposed to be a front runner. And something similar taking place in New Hampshire. This poll has him up higher. This does not look like a front runner. And the national polling does not the election make. Meaning just because Joe Biden is being strong in the national polls, we don't choose a candidate from the standpoint of primaries based on national polls. Those are chosen by slogging it out in one state after the next. Joe Biden could look strong in the national polls. If you remember, Sanders and Clinton, in many respects, he was beating Clinton in national polls. It didn't matter. It's the state polls that are of concern. One thing that I want to point out before moving on from this little known question, or this little question that I think has a major influence in regards to the campaigns themselves. Who are you more excited by? That's basically 2 questions. How excited are you to support a candidate how excited are you to support the various candidates? Meaning, how extremely excited are you? Extremely excited for Sanders, it's at 44%. Like, think, like, that number is extraordinary. The next closest is Warren with 21%. He doubles her. And then Biden with 19%. That's an extraordinary number. Meaning, when you ask, how excited are you to support this candidate? And they are lighting themselves on fire to support that candidate. Second question, how likely are you to support your candidate? Meaning, are you going to deviate from your candidate? Over 50% of Sanders supporters said no. 57% of Sanders supporters says, no, I made up my mind. I'm not changing my mind. This is my guy. Warren has 29%. Biden has 43%. Warren has to be very careful with this. Her polling is soft, meaning many of the people are seeing her for the very first time. And while she's been strong and she's been somewhat of a media darling, it seems like the media is doing this weird flip where, oh, maybe she's not electable. Maybe she's slowing down. Maybe. It's amazing the way they flip on a dime on this stuff. But her support is soft. She may be able to solidify that support, by the way. And part of the reason that I think Sanders needs to be a little bit more strident in his critiques is to not allow that to solidify. Think back to the election between Romney and Obama. Obama was criticized early on for spending a lot of money in the early states. Now, he was focusing a lot of his campaign on making sure that the public knew, especially in the primary states or the swing states that he needed, that Romney was an out-of-touch billionaire or out-of-touch millionaire, and that he didn't care about their interests, and that he had worked as a vulture capitalist for Bain Capital, stripping companies. Now, the benefit of this was that anything that took place was put through this lens of Romney as an out-of-touch billionaire. Meaning the money that Obama spent in those early states paid off by enshrining the narratives of Romney. I make the argument here for the same thing with Warren. The moment that she can solidify that support, it will be difficult to get those people away from her within the context of their support for her. Meaning, right now, you have the potential because her support is soft. If that support solidifies, it will become much harder to move them people away from that. This poll is very interesting, to say the least. And this poll is not necessarily an outlier. Many of the polling goes in that direction, with this notion that there seems to be a three-way race, especially in the early primary states. And depending on the poll that you watch, you would see one person being in the lead or another being in the lead, but ultimately it seems to be a three-way race. What I want to point out to you, though, and I think is the most important and overriding thing, is if you add Sanders and Warren, and again, I make the point to you that Warren is ape Sanders, meaning whatever you want to think of Warren, ultimately the policy and the positions that she's shown and that she's projected to people has been decidedly to the left. If you put those two together, you get a winner in the race. Meaning, combined, Biden just loses. Left to having them split their vote, you have a three-way tie. They're literally splitting the vote, and it's still, in many respects, either leading Biden in some polls or tying with him in others. Whatever you want to think of the direction of the Democratic Party, and I would even point out to this from the standpoint of the billionaires that are trying to get into the race, or people from Bain Capital trying to get into the race, or anybody but Sanders in that coalition, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Pete Buttigieg, and a bunch of other Democrats meeting to figure out a way to stop Sanders. I mean, the title of the article from the New York Times was literally, "Stop Sanders." And then asking, is there anybody else there? A lot of this is because of that 60% of Democrats that want something else. If you want to know the direction of the party, and if you want to know what at the very least the population wants, not the established order of things that are trying to retain their power and their grip on the party itself, if you want to know what the public actually wants, it's there. It's there, especially if you're talking about the Democratic Party. And I would argue that a lot of these guys polls independents, and especially for somebody like Sanders, who's hard to poll just because he has so many youth and so many young people and independents that he pulls into the political process. The public has made a choice, or is making a choice, and that choice seems to be decidedly to the chagrin of people like Pelosi and Schumer and the right-wing Democrats that are in the race, decidedly to the left. This
Network. Network. Network.
This is Jamarl Thomas, WRWK 93.9 FM, The Work. I'm going to thank you guys for joining us. It is 5:52. We're about to hit the hour. Guys, if you enjoy this content, you would like to underwrite and support this content, you can do so. You can call 804-464-1089. 804-464-1089. Yeah, not quite yet. And that's to support the content and underwrite the content. Actually, if we have a caller, let's hear him. What's the gentleman on the phone? We are at the top of the hour, so might as well. There's no harm in
Maggie, did you want to be on air?
accepting this. Let's see. What's his name?
Maggie?
Okay. What's going on, Maggie?
Hang on a second. I got the agenda. Give me a second. You'll hear the station, and then you'll hear him. Okay, here we go.
How's it going, Maggie? Can you hear me okay? Excellent. Absolutely. Great to talk with you, too. So what would you like to discuss? Is it anything that I've mentioned, or is there something separate and distinct that strikes your fancy today for you to call in? Excellent. Go for it.
Oh,
Hey, Ron. Ron. This is what. Headphones. I want to put it on the mic.
oh. You can't hear? Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Check on for you.
That's what I mean. That's okay.
That's good.
I give the litany of things like, he thinks that Chelsea Manning should, her sentence should not have been commuted, and all that, those all.
Not to mention African, and I didn't mention the African American thing, but somebody, I think it was Clyburn, says, "Oh, we have homophobia in African American community," missing the point that Buttigieg's record about African Americans in Indiana is atrocious. I mean, firing the black captain when they were found racism, all sorts of stuff.
Oh yeah. The whole thing that happened with the police chief that he and they're just playing that down like the police chief did something just really horrible, and it doesn't make sense to me that it seems to me like he would want to know what was going on in his police force. If it's got a corrupt culture, you can't do anything about it unless you really know.
Correct.
So I really did not like the way he handled that.
I find him to be, he has a tenor and a poise like Obama to me. Like, I jokingly say he's like the gay Obama. What the difference is, he doesn't, but he doesn't compel the same level of credibility or gravitas. Like, it's not to mention, Obama was pretty big on the black vote. He was able to get other demographics to vote for him. And Buttigieg doesn't seem to command that level of acumen or political acumen.
Well, exactly, and I kind of think he might possibly be deep state, but I'm not going to go there. I tend to be a conspiracy person. But I won't go there because a lot of people get really put off by that.
It's the naming. It's the name. That's all. When, like, for example, when somebody said deep state, it comes across as there's something esoteric and mysterious. The truth is, there are people who, presidents come and go, and they're a mechanism that keeps our country ticking along in spite of the president. I mean, for God's sake, Donald Trump has been in office for 3 years? And you still have had a country that, for the most part, has kept a similar tenor despite the actions and the motivations of the president. I mean, Trump says, I want to get us out of Afghanistan and Syria, and everybody flip out. So to put it in perspective, the whims of the president, it's not that a president can't command a certain degree of will in spite of what the established order wants. But it's not easy. And so, like, I know, like, when people say deep state, it comes across as, this kind of mysterious thing. I think what people mean, though, is more so the mechanisms that allow our country to, for the most part, keep a similar policy in spite of the presidents that come and go.
Well, I wanted to point out something about also Buttigieg and, in general, kind of segue into something else.
Yes.
Is when I looked into him, and he is a linguist, and, he's also
Rhodes Scholar.
Had a security clearance. So he uses, and I have some hypnosis training. So he uses neuro-linguistic programming and conversational hypnosis when he gives his speeches, and also when he does interviews.
Don't all of them?
And, it's like second nature to him. But
No. What I mean is, don't all of them. Like all candidates, or most candidates.
That's not that much.
Okay.
I mean, I've noticed some of them. They like Kamala. She makes the mistake of using her finger of pointing, and you never do that because that's an aggressive move.
Yeah.
I don't know why she does that.
I'm not against that. I like, when you watch British politics and you watch these guys at the dispatch box, like, this is entirely cultural. I'm old enough to remember when Bill Clinton was dinged for that. And if you notice, he started using this kind of weird hand thing where all of them started doing it. They was like, they close their hands together or something like that, or he would like use his fist and a thumb because they didn't necessarily want to do the pointing. Personally, I like the pointing. I like it when they're aggressive. And I am okay with women being aggressive, going after their political opponents. In fact, I like it. I think it's more honest. Interesting. But I'm saying I'm okay with it in either case. Like, don't get me wrong. When guys are, look, we're stuck in cultural traditions, right? It's just kind of the way it is. And all of us are thrust into an environment that has certain racial lines, there's gender lines, and there are things that we have historical precedent that gives us certain perspectives in the way we view these things. Meaning, even if in my head, the other woman, difference is she has a vagina and breasts, that's it. From my standpoint, meaning that she has every right within the context of this reality frame to live her life to the fullest degree that she wants to live her life. I don't consider her any better or worse than I am. However, me saying that is a little bit different than if you're on a debate stage and you're pointing at her and they're like, oh my God, he's so sexist because he's pointing at her. And it's like, well, no, he's not being sexist, he's just getting his point across. But that doesn't matter. Like, from the standpoint of a society that is within a cultural context, and there's also the political currents that incentivize certain people to use various attacks to go after their candidates. I mean, for God's sake, in Britain right now, Joe Swinson is saying it's sexist because she's not allowed on a debate stage. It has nothing to do with sexism. The New York Times is saying that it's sexist because Joe Biden said that Elizabeth Warren was an elitist. I mean, the woman literally was a professor at Harvard. It's like, come on. It doesn't stop those attacks.
Just be,
Remember, speaking. Level tones. Speaking level tones.
just announce it. I'll do it.
Okay.
Sickening. And what I realized is they, they're both Rhodes Scholars and all
Yeah.
that stuff. But what I realized was
They
Rachel
relate.
Maddow also used.
Not to mention they're both, well, I'm not going to say, well, they're both gay. They're both white. They're both Rhodes Scholars. There's one difference where, man and woman, both of them are part of the Democratic Party establishment per se. Both of, so there's more commonalities to it than just this kind of liberal intellectual class. I mean, it's also a Democratic establishment of sorts that is looking for a person because they don't think Biden can hold it. And if you listen to Buttigieg himself said, I think this race is going to be between me and Elizabeth Warren. It's like, why do you believe that? Why do you believe that? Why do you believe that?
I believe anything he says, and then, well, even if you can even figure out if he's actually saying anything. But yeah, when I saw him in South Carolina convention, he leaned into a Southern accent.
Did he? Did he?
It wasn't real apparent, but he just kind of leaned into it,
Speaking of leaning into things,
It was very subtle.
let me lean
Like,
into a short station break. Can you hear me?
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I want to lean into a short station
Okay.
break.
We're at the hour. Don't go anywhere.
To go away.
Yeah.
I want to say that
Okay.
this is WRWK LPFM 93.9, serving Chesterfield, Henrico, Richmond, Goochland, and Hanover, and the entire universe if you're on the internet. So, back over to this exciting conversation.
That's what you meant. I didn't. I was like, wait, what? It's at the hour. That's why. Fair enough. Okay. Thank you. All right. Go for it, Maggie. I'm sorry.
yeah, anyway, so he leaned into a Southern. He leaned. Well, can I tell you what happened when I went to the convention?
Yes, go for it.
I don't live in South Carolina, but I went as a guest because I was curious.
Oh, cool.
Anyway, so I have a friend at home who wanted to know when Tulsi was going to speak, and they were very much on time, exactly when the speakers were going to speak. So when Tulsi came on, and they only allowed MSNBC to film, or to run it live at the convention, and so I think it was like 2:11 p.m. or something, and they said Tulsi was going to be on, and then she was watching, and then Tulsi came on, and they went right away to a laxative.
Yeah.
I'm not kidding. They went to a laxative commercial.
They hate her. They hate her guts. They hate her guts. They hate her guts. I mean, honestly, I was going to do this as one of the segments. She's put out a lawsuit. No, not a lawsuit. Her lawyers have gotten involved and said Clinton needs to essentially give an apology and recant her comments. Now, this is 3 weeks after the event has taken place, and Tulsi gets a big bump in the polling for the pushback with Clinton, meaning the Clinton attacking her is essentially an anti-vote. It helps her because people hate Hillary Clinton. She got on the poll. She is going to be on the debate stage, and she has Hillary Clinton to thank for it.
Yeah, she does.
Real talk. Yeah, they really dislike her. Maggie, is there anything else before we end it? And I want to thank you for calling.
Well, I just wanted to say that with Rachel Maddow, what I have noticed with her, like, I noticed that there's a neurolinguistic programming thing that you do. Well, first of all, she repeats things 3 times.
Oh.
That's the thing. And the subconscious does not understand the word not or no. So when she was talking about Bolton and Pompeo, she will say I like him or not, and then she'll repeat that 3 times. And what the subconscious hears is like him. So when she wants to do her warmongering and promote the war propaganda with people like Pompeo and Bolton, she will say like him or not.
Yes. Yeah, well, see, I don't know if, I guess it could be neurolinguistics. I have a tendency to double talk myself. Like, not double talk, but where I would repeat. And I promise you, it's not on purpose. It's a tendency that I have when I look at my videos, and I've noticed I would say the same thing over and over. Like, not the same thing, but I would say something and then say it again as if to reiterate it. But it's not necessarily intentional. Sometimes it's just the way my brain works. But it's possible, especially if you... But that's what I'm saying. If you're getting $10 million to be a propagandist, which, I mean, it's MSNBC. Her job is to promote a certain political perspective and point of view. I don't ding her for it. I mean, the show is literally named The Rachel Maddow Show, so she's doing her job. I don't necessarily have to like it, especially with all the Russia mongering and so forth. I mean, at a certain point, it comes across as just Russophobic. But nevertheless, if you're doing a political perspective, is that wrong? Now, it's manipulative, yes, especially if it's trying to undermine or get under kind of just the intellect of the person. I would even go further and say that the people who are watching your channel, though, may not even need that. If you've been a Rachel Maddow watcher and you watched her year after year after year, and she gets on, you accept what she's giving almost as by default. You know, like think about, was there ever a time when you watched MSNBC or her show?
Well, you know, I didn't watch her in the early days because I really don't watch TV. So,
Mm.
you know, for this purposes, I watched her and it was like, oh my God,
I used to watch her, and I'll take this one off the air. Thank you, Mag. I appreciate you calling in.
Thank you indeed.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
I used to watch Maddow, Oberman, Cedar. Like, when I first started getting into feeling my political umphness of sorts. I don't know what to call it. Getting my political backup, if you want to call it that. I didn't start at politics. I started at history. Like, I used to get enamored by historical stories or historical studies. I found it to be utterly and entirely fascinating in a way that I didn't when I was younger. I mean, my awareness came similar to chess. When I first started chess, the games that I used to be most interested in were the ones that were swashbuckling games, like by Mikhail Tal, where you would have the situation where the guy, you have no idea what's going on, even though all of the pieces are on the board for everybody to see, and he whips something out where you're like, oh my God, I can't believe, A, he had the gumption to do it, but B, that he was willing to risk it to do it. And yet, those were the games that were the most fascinating. Same thing with Garry Kasparov did. Absolutely complicated. The games from people like Karpov or Petrosian, and I know I'm getting into the weeds with this, but those games were games where it was just strangulation. Meaning it wasn't the swashbuckling stuff. It was one man grabbing another man by the throat and squeezing it until his head popped off. And the guy not being able to get away out of the process and eventually resigns because he can't do anything. I mean, those games come across as being slow and methodical, but as I got older, I found those games to be utterly and entirely fascinating in a way that I didn't. My historical awareness came about the same way, where during the time that I was ill, I would read and study. And I found there's a lot of stuff that school didn't teach me, perspectives that school never gave me. And a lot of this came from lectures. A lot of this came from and leftist thought. At the time, Bush was at war. And Keith Olbermann and Rachel Maddow were strong on that point. I mean, it's hard to get across what Keith Olbermann did in the standpoint of revolutionizing MSNBC's talk media. If you remember, Olbermann would come out, he would do a show, and eventually when the war started kicking off and he started getting more animated about what was taking place from the standpoint of Bush, he started doing monologues. And he started doing what he called special segments. And he would go for like 15 minutes railing at Bush. At the height of his lungs, losing it, hysterical, screaming at Bush. And you watch that, you're like, wow. He would do show after show. And he got to the point where he's like, I can't keep calling it a special comment if I'm doing it every night. But he would rail magnificently. And I realized, it's like, Olbermann is right on this. Now, what I realized the world had changed is when Obama gets in office and all of them shut up. That's when I was like, oh, that's what's going on. Because some of the stuff that Obama was doing was the stuff that Bush was doing. I mean, Obama was dropping those bombs from drones. I mean, he dropped, over 20,000 bombs in his last year in office. And he was pushing those regime change wars. He was more dignified than Bush. He had more of a gravitas than Bush. He could sing Al Green extremely well. But just because he could sing Al Green doesn't mean people should be okay with him starting wars in other countries, meaning these kind of regime change wars that resulted in about 500,000 people dying in Syria, not to mention the thousands that died in Libya. Do you realize in many of those campaigns that he was dropping those drones, 90% of the people were civilians? I mean, at that point, you can't even say you're hitting terrorists. You're just murdering civilians. Now, I don't know why that would be okay. And Whether that's Bush that's doing it, whether that's Obama that's doing it, or whether that's Trump that's doing it, I don't understand why that would be okay. And yet, for the most part, all of them had nothing else to say. This also became clear when Trump got in office, and all of a sudden everybody had something to say again. Do you realize Oberman goes on The View and he says essentially like, oh, I can't believe I was railing at Bush like that. And I looked at that and it's like, God, you're an embarrassment. George Bush was responsible for the deaths of over 1 million people. The kids who are 18 years old, who are starting to vote today, their entire life, we've been at war. A war, just so we're clear, started off of something that wasn't true and that was nevertheless pushed by the media. Meaning the media entirely and utterly discredited themselves, pushing this notion of weapons of mass destruction. And there was no calling to account for all of those people that died. 1 million people. Understand what that looks like if you pile up 1 million people in your street. We did that. That was us. That was us. That was what we did when we went into that war. And there was no consequences for Bush. None. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And even if you want to give Bush a pass on the weapons of mass destruction nonsense, which I don't understand why, considering the number of people that have died in that war and the fact that we're still in those wars. What about torture? Is torture against the law or not? It is. It is against our laws and it's against international law. And yet, no consequence. George Bush is in his footy pajamas finger painting right now. No consequence. My point is this. We should be against those things regardless of who the president is. I gotta be honest. I don't care who the president is. I have ideological things that I agree with or disagree with. When Trump gets rid of the TPP, I say, yay, yay, Trump. Good job. When he says, I'm going to get us out of Syria, when he's not really getting us out of Syria, but when he says it, I say, yay, yay, good job. When Donald Trump does pretty much everything else, I was like, oh God, he's horrible. It's an ideological thing. It's not a party thing. And I would put to you that you, whoever you are, should look at the world in similar terms. I can't tell you how you should vote. I can't tell you how, and none of this stuff. All those things are your choice. But I'm talking about looking at the world not entirely through partisan eyes. Looking at it based on your own ideological choices and the things that you want to see in the world versus the things you don't want to see. And whether you like the person or not should be secondary to what you want to see in the world and whether you should support a person in regards to what they're doing. I don't care Obama can sing Al Green. I care that Flint, Michigan didn't get its water fixed. I don't care that he can play basketball. I don't care that he's black. What I care about is that 95% of the wealth was sucked up to the top 1% or the income gains. What I care about is that he threw himself to protect the bankers while letting homeowners go bust. I accept that Obamacare, essentially a right-wing healthcare plan, got multiple, I think millions more in regards to the healthcare rolls. But it still left 20 million people off the rolls under this utopian idea that insurance companies still should be the major part of this process. And in Obama's own words, by the way, when he was chastising Hillary Clinton, healthcare companies would love a system that forces people onto the healthcare rolls. He was saying that as an attack on Hillary Clinton and ended up doing the exact same thing himself. What I care about are ideological things, not partisan politics. And the failure of partisan politics is watching shows like MSNBC or Fox News, or for that matter, even CNN, and the way that they gaslight and they go against or for various opponents. I agree with you. I was shocked when I came to that awareness. And I was one of those people who watched MSNBC, enjoyed the Rachel Maddow show, until she went functionally insane with the Russiagate stuff. She cried that day that they came out where Mueller was like, yeah, we didn't find anything. All right, this is WRWK 93.9 FM, The Work. Maggie, I want to thank you for calling in. Let's go to a quick commercial break, and we will be back right after.
Network. Network.
103.9 FM. The work coming out of Chesterfield, a chilly day in Chesterfield, that's to put it mildly. Just to go over a few quick stories that is bubbling up in the news. Some of these I greatly approve of. Others, I have to be honest, I am horrified and powerless, despite being angry about it. So the first, one of our closest allies, extremely close with Trump and Obama and Bush, and for the last 40, 50 years or so, going back to FDR, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has just criminalized feminism. If you are a feminist and you're in Saudi Arabia, you are breaking the law. Apparently, the lawyers interviewed who states professing feminism, including on Twitter, can result in jail or flogging. I suppose that's better than beheading. And the question becomes, what do they even mean by feminism? See, the problem is with some of this stuff that these labels are dodgy at best. And if you can use this label and use it in a legal sense, well, feminism can be subjective to whoever is in power, right? Maybe a woman wanting to drive is being a feminist. Maybe a woman not wanting to get permission from her kid, her son, to go out the house, maybe she's being a bit of a feminist. What does that mean? And understand the fact that they're making that against the law is outright extraordinary. You can make a case that it was already against the law, considering they were locking people up for trying to drive, and if I'm not mistaken, was going to put the woman to death who was initiating that stuff even after allowing the law to pass for them to drive. This is a country that cuts off heads, puts on spikes, crucifies. It is our ally. And apparently Donald Trump and even Obama, these guys would scream about Iran. Go back and listen to Donald Trump's speech at the UN. Much of that speech, he's talking about Iran, and it sounds like he's talking about Saudi Arabia. It is the weirdest thing in the world. The Tulsi memo makes it extremely clear that the U.S. turns a blind eye to allies that are dictators, strongmen, or have outright otherwise horrific records in regards to human rights in their societies. So Turkey, pushed by Erdogan, who's somewhat of a strong man, Saudi Arabia, get a pass. China, Iran, and Russia, oh, they're no-nos. And so you can attack them. The logic of the Tulsi memo, which makes all the sense in the world, and for the most part, I would even argue, has been modus operandi, even from the standpoint of a complicit media that runs along with it, is that you treat our allies better than you treat our enemies. And that means bringing up the bad things that our ally or our enemies do, while ignoring those things from the standpoint of our allies. Now, this is never more true than in foreign policy from the standpoint of South America. The United States has been responsible for multiple coups in Latin America, and the latest, or the most recent, is probably Venezuela. That one probably has been in the news the most. Juan Guaido, who was the patsy who had been working with the U.S. government, comes up and says this election was dodgy. Now, the truth of the matter is that the U.S. had instructed them not to participate in the election so they could turn around and say that the election was dodgy. And saying that the election was dodgy, Juan Guaido refuses to accept the election results, and then even pushes for a military uprising that essentially goes nowhere because he doesn't necessarily have support at home, despite the U.S. giving money and resources and attention to what he wants. Basically, what they want are the oil reserves in Venezuela. And Guaido would be the one that will sell his country out if he could take power in order to give those reserves over. Notice something for the moment. This is not a rah-rah Maduro. This is more so a rah-rah that we should not be engaged in politics where we are trying to topple or knock down governments that we don't like. I say that to be true whether it's Hong Kong, because the U.S. has been working with the opposition forces in Hong Kong for two main reasons. If China has an outsized reaction, meaning sending military in order to pacify what is taking place in Hong Kong, the U.S. would scream and howl and point, along with its other Western countries that are in alliance with the United States. If they don't, and they are able to peel Hong Kong away in some kind of way, that will also be a win. Both of those scenarios are a win. Elements of the U.S. have been seen and photographed working with elements of the opposition, including figures that are in Hong Kong. I believe the gentleman's name is Lai, who is an anti-China guy, very rich, and has been assisting with the funding, not to mention meeting with elements like John Bolton and other people who are in the U.S. upper echelon. China knows this, and they've said as much in their press releases, saying, stay out of our affairs. Now, the catch here is that these protests have gotten far more violent, with some people being stabbed, and this is by quote-unquote, pro-democracy forces, and in other cases, them attacking people who are pro-China. This is a weird mix, because I have to be honest, what's right here, and I often say right and wrong don't exist. What matters is action and consequences. Right and wrong is a little bit difficult and often depends on the individuals who are involved in the process, and based on some kind of standard, not from the standpoint of an absolute God. That becomes somewhat difficult to figure out here. I think it's true, and I think it's fair to say that Hong Kong was stolen from China. I think that's a flat fact. I mean, ultimately, the Brits got angry that China was ornery about being forced open for commerce, especially selling opium in China. And having these rebellions to try to push back the yoke of Western influence as kind of imperialist forces, Britain retaliates by taking Hong Kong. Now, despite of how Hong Kong was taken, how many years have passed under British control? And by the way, the Brits were not the best rulers. I hate to tell you this. I'm saying this from somebody who visited Kenya and could watch the museum and the hierarchy and the codes that Britain put in order to retain its power in that country. Well, Hong Kong and the people in that country weren't treated that much, if not at all, better. Which is all the weirder that these guys are holding British and American flags. The wild part is, and I think the nub of it is, that when Britain handed Hong Kong back over to China, supposedly in 50 years at the time of the handoff date, they were supposed to be reacclimated into China. Up to that point, two systems, one country. This law that they were passing that would have allowed people to be pushed back to mainland set off a firestorm. What people sometimes forget is that revolutions and things that kick off don't do it in a vacuum. Meaning it's not, I think I want to have a revolution one day, and you just start one. Oftentimes there are environmental factors that allow you the opportunity to do so. This law that they were passing was such an opportunity that allowed a certain degree of hysteria to be kicked up and an organization to be accrued around this notion of pushing back against and pulling itself away from China. My thought was this had to escalate. I could in no way see how this de-escalated. If they are concerned about sending people over to mainland China, and in 40 years they're supposed to be reabsorbed into China, then where does this end? Like, if this is the law that you're complaining about, and you are literally supposed to be reabsorbed back into China, and the two-system thing is supposed to break down, then where does this go? Doesn't this, by definition, have to escalate if you're concerned about one thing when the other thing is even more over the top? Meaning, the reabsorption into China is far more significant than a law that was passed to allow people to be shipped to mainland China. And if you're complaining about the law, when in X number of years you're going to be reabsorbed, then how do you stop this movement? And this notion of a pro-democracy movement, we always call pro-democracy when it's things that we agree with. Ultimately, what they're talking about, to some degree, is based on a certain degree of economic issues that have provoked this, but also a freaked outness with this notion of being reabsorbed and the system breaking down. Does China not have a point that ultimately Hong Kong is their country in the same way that we consider Hawaii ours? And we will be weirded out if Hawaii was doing anti-American protests in the same way that Hong Kong is doing anti-China protests. You must understand, from China's point of view, this is a deep, deep hurt This was a point in China's history where they couldn't defend themselves against Western imperial powers, and that their land, was ripped away in retaliation. And you fast forward, and a government that still exists from back then, or the very least after the war, so let's say it that way, looks at that country, at Hong Kong, and considers it theirs. And yet, this hurt that was brought about in an area where they couldn't defend themselves now gets punctuated with the U.S. bringing this up and engaging itself into making this that much worse. Same thing with selling weapons to Taiwan. This is a sore spot. That's my point. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that the protesters are wrong. The protesters may not want to be absorbed into China, nor are they wrong as an absolute for taking that particular disposition. The protests and the violence of those protests, I mean, after all, we've been sanitizing what's been going on there. I mean, the burning down of police stations, the shutting down of airports, the attacking people in airports, the attacking cops at the moment that the cops do anything. I mean, these are the most passive cops on the planet that I've ever seen in my life. But the moment that the police do anything, they howl. This is tactics, regime change tactics 101. You have people, terrorists of sorts, creating all sorts of chaos and havoc. And the moment the police do anything about it to push back on the chaos and havoc, the Western media, or the media that is involved in trying to get across a propagandistic view of it, screams and howls at the cops, not at what the protesters were doing in order to spur the cops to action. Whatever you want to think of the Hong Kong and China issue, let's accept that right and wrong in this case is not the easiest thing to discern, and ultimately you just have points of view of people involved in the process. The secondary question, and maybe the most apropos question for the people in the United States, is should we be involved in trying to instigate ourselves into the affair of this nation? And we are, in a clandestine way, doing so. The other country I want to talk about is Bolivia. And I have to be honest, but from all of it, I have been most bothered by the issue in Bolivia. This is a coup. Fortunately, some of our congressmen could say so. There was one candidate in the race that has said so. And I can't support anybody that can't. That's where I'm at. You have a person who's cut poverty in half. Evo Morales has said that the only crime he's committed is being indigenous and essentially being an anti-imperialist. And he's right. He wants to use the resources of Bolivia, which has the largest lithium reserves for Bolivians, and using the gas for Bolivians. One of the things that he was going to do is to industrialize the production of lithium in his country, meaning he was going to nationalize the lithium markets and industrialize it for the people of Bolivia. So instead of sending off just lithium, he was going to make the batteries in-house in that country to create jobs for the people in Bolivia, not to mention increasing the standard of living. He declined to sell lithium from this point, and again was going to create the batteries. Illiteracy from 2006 to 2018 fell from 13% to just 2.4%. Unemployment fell by 9.2 to 4.1% from 2006 to 2018. Poverty was at 60.6% and fell to 34.6% in 2018. Extreme poverty fell from 38.2% to 15.2%. And that's not even talking about the GDP that spiked. By all metrics, Evo succeeded. Evo just got elected again, and the right wing would not assent to the election results. The Supreme Court has said that Evo had every just reason to run, meaning there was nothing illegal about him running for a fourth term. And if you remember, FDR won a fourth term. So did Angela Merkel, who's been there forever. But for whatever reason, that's a big deal for Evo. You must understand that the people who are running and doing this coup are right-wingers. You have some who are outright fascists who are burning down political buildings, dragging political people on the left out into the streets. In one case, dragged a woman into the street, put red paint on her, had her walking through the streets barefoot and shaving her head, trying to get her to resign. In other cases, you've had family members threatened, houses burned down, military walking through the streets, mass arrests, show trials. Evo was ferreted to Mexico, where he is safe, and the Mexican government has called it what it was, a outright coup. This is a gentleman from Center for Policy Research. The argument that was made by the OAS, which 60% of the funding from the OAS comes from the United States, and for the most part, has themselves a record of, for the most part, going with countries that are against the U.S. interests. Evo is literally an anti-imperialist. And if you look at his speech in the UN, you get a good feel for who he is and what he stands for. This right-wing coup, whether pushed by the U.S. or not, at the very least, it had the backing of an organization that is, for all intents and purposes, an arm of soft power of the United States, meaning the OAS. And they gave a dodgy accounting of the election results without giving any evidence at all. And the Center for Policy Research, their research comes out and says, there is no statistical anomalies in this at all. Ultimately, these guys put out a dodgy report that the media, for the most part, ran with without having any evidence to back it up in the least. And the statistical analysis of it shows that there was no issue with the election results. And even if you do think that there was an issue with the election results, Evo came out and said, fine, let's have another election, in which the opposition moved the goalposts. Yeah, we don't want another election. Or, at the very least, we don't want you running in that election. He has every right to run in that election, just like he had every right to run in this election. And the polling results, again, he won in the first round. There were free and fair elections in Bolivia. Not anymore. The people who are coming to power are unelected. The rule of law has been smashed. And a man who provided universal health care, who cut poverty in half, who was using the resources of that country for the people of that country, was toppled by a rich group of right-wing fascists to take down the government because they didn't like his rule. They didn't like the fact that he supported the poor, nor did they like the fact that he, first indigenous person to win, was in office in the first place. Bolivia has taken a right-wing turn. It is disturbing to me. It angers me. And I think part of the anger is the powerlessness associated with it, not to mention by all metrics, he was a decent guy. Like, you can't call him Maduro. You can't say the guy's a dictator. You can't say the guy's a brute. The guy literally stepped down from power in order to avoid a civil war. Whatever I think of that, I have bad feelings entirely about what is taking place in Bolivia. And even though I think AOC's response was somewhat weak, I accept the fact that she calls it, at the very least, a coup. Even though I think Ilhan's response was slightly weak, I still accept that she called it a coup. And even though I think Sanders' perspective was more on point, he calls it a coup. I appreciate them doing that. I don't like these faux lefties who are out there screaming that this is somehow a good result, that a person who essentially cut poverty in half in his country, used the resources of his country for the people of his country, got rid of the U.S. military bases out of his country, is now fleeing to Mexico in exile, while the people who supported him are being beaten, arrested, or in some respects killed. This is not a good turn. The same thing happened in Honduras under Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State. And Clinton tried to argue that it wasn't a coup, that the military escorted the guy out in his pajamas, the leader of the country out in his pajamas. We should not be involved in this. My other point in this is whether we were directly involved in this or not. I mean, after all, the right wing in that country didn't need the United States to be involved in this process. What is true is that they did see the U.S. response in Venezuela. The right wing was working with the U.S. in Venezuela and would not capitulate. Now, the question then is, why would they capitulate? You have a superpower backing you. They're giving you money. They're giving you a media arm so you can just kind of promote your particular point of view. They've closed the embassies. They have effectively helped you monstrously. Why would you capitulate? Meaning our response creates an incentive in the opposition parties to not accept the election results, knowing that you will have U.S. backing if you do not. And that rule of law entirely depends upon whether or not the U.S. agrees with your particular tenor as a country. The same thing is true in Bolivia, right? What does the right wing in that country thinks the U.S. perspective would be for a president that they can't stand and they detest? They knew what the response of the U.S. would be, and they took this opportunity to go this route, knowing that the U.S.'s tenor would at the very least be approving, which it has been from the standpoint of Pompeo and Trump, and again, the OAS, which is a tool of soft power for the United States, screaming that the election was dodgy, and from the right wing in this country. People like Rubio. Do you know, you might not know this, there were records that were released with the right wing in this country calling for a coup. It is also very clear that many of these people have been caught doing these kind of Nazi salutes and whatnot in the country, and these are the people that took power. They've been burning the indigenous flag. One of the positive things that Evo did was ensure that the indigenous community could be part of the Constitution. Not anymore. They're burning indigenous flags. I don't know what Bolivia is going to look like, but if it's any indication from what Honduras looks like now after their coup, this will be a sad, sad series of events that are likely to transpire. I was bothered by this greatly. I don't entirely know why. I think part of it is I don't like this notion of unfairness with people who, for the most part, have tried to do good things. And I think that is exactly what's taking place here. Conversely, up to that point, it was actually a good week for the left. Lula released from prison. The Supreme Court comes out and says if a person has additional, what are the names of those things? If they have additional petitions to the court, then you can't put them in prison, or at the very least they have to be let out. Lula still had additional petitions to the court, and as such, he was let out. Now, this was a big win. It was very clear by the information that was released that Lula's imprisonment was essentially a political witch hunt, where they were using the tools of government in order to get rid of political opponents. Selective justice is not justice, whether Lula did anything wrong or not. It's almost secondary to all of the other people that were also massively corrupt. They got him out the way by putting him in jail, and I don't even accept that he did anything wrong in the first place. They did the same thing with the other woman that was in power, that was part of the Workers' Party. They got rid of her on some kind of corruption charge, again, with a lot of other people around her that was massively corrupt. Bolsonaro took power of outright fascists is in office entirely because of the coup and the soft coup that took place in Brazil. But Lula, at the very least, is out. He still is going to have to deal with the courts, and right now the right wing in the country are trying to find ways to put him back in prison. But right now he is going to create a front that is opposition to what Bolsonaro is doing in that country. And because of who he is and the popularity that he has, he will be able to marshal that to his ends. And again, Sharma Shawant wins her race in spite of the $1.5 million that Amazon is dropping on her race. And for the last point, just in the news, Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi Gabbard's lawyer has sent a cease and desist letter. Not a cease and desist, I'm sorry. Essentially a letter demanding a retraction from Hillary Clinton, calling her a Russian asset. Now, Hillary Clinton's camp tried to clean this up and say, well, we were talking about Republicans. Nonsense. You can listen to it for yourself. She was very clear that she was saying that Tulsi Gabbard and Jill Stein was being groomed by the Russians. Gabbard, in her case, to run as a third party. Here's the catch. Tulsi Gabbard, this was maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago that Clinton did this. Gabbard has seen a rise in the polls as a result of this. Again, you saw the New Hampshire. She surged up to 5 points. Kamala Harris is down 1. Pete Buttigieg and has subsumed many of the vote tally from Kamala Harris. Interestingly enough, though, why so long? Why so long? Why did you take nearly a month before you put this out? You could have put this out on day one. I have been saying you should have sued Hillary Clinton for defamation of character and slander right off the bat. She said you, a person who is serving in our military, who was receiving sensitive briefings because of your military service and her record, that you were somehow being groomed by the Russians because you took a political disposition that says these wars were not beneficial, A, to this country, B, to our budget, and C, to the men and women who actually put on the uniform, not for economic and geopolitical reasons of knocking over countries that some group of elite don't particularly like and think that they can make profit off of those particular countries. No, they put the uniform on in order to defend this nation, and it is not what they have been used for. Her argument is we need to stop that. And Clinton says, well, look, if you want to stop supporting terrorists and stop knocking over governments, then you're a Russian asset. It's silly. And yet you had Democratic lemmings repeating this. Joy Behar on The View, to her face, repeats this, and Tulsi Gabbard puts her down, essentially saying this is nonsense. And with the irony of ironies, with Joy Behar being a useful idiot, because the only person she would get this stuff from is people who are soaking in Democratic Party propaganda, calling Gabbard a useful idiot. Utterly astonishing. She should have did this lawsuit earlier. But from a political standpoint, it does make sense. Gabbard was able to get a bump off of Clinton and the media coverage associated with it. I mean, after all, this was all over the media, with people who are supposed to be rational adults asking Gabbard, hey, Clinton said you're a Russian asset, are you? And are you running in a third party? And despite her saying this like 1,000 times that she was not, they would still frame their mouth to ask her a question as if there are not better questions to ask. Whatever you want to think of Gabbard, she is a fascinating candidate, especially on this issue of foreign policy. And she bucks the trend on foreign policy from both wings. Meaning, the Democratic Party, for the most part, has a consensus with the Republican Party on issues of war. It is okay for us to topple governments. We will do it for different reasons. One party would scream humanitarian bombs, meaning the bombs that Obama dropped danced between the raindrops and only hit bad people, versus the other one who just says it's America's will to do so and foment some issue of a war. This is a one-party consensus, meaning both. I argue that the Democratic Party and Republican Party are really the same party. They're just different wings. They've just conned people into believing that those are two different parties. Their view and framing of the world is exactly the same, with a modicum of difference. But does a small degree of difference really a secondary party make? Or are these just two wings quibbling over minor distinctions? In this case, especially from the standpoint of war, they, for the most part, agree. She does not. And in such, not to mention the stepping down in order to support Sanders. Do you know Clinton sent her an unhinged letter, or the Clinton camp sent her an unhinged letter saying you are being disrespectful to Hillary Clinton by supporting Bernie Sanders? It's an astonishing letter to read. She is being penalized for that action now, with the lemmings in the Democratic Party attacking her in this way. Not to mention, again, the foreign policy, which both parties find consensus on. If you're a reporter, think of all the things that you can ask somebody who breaks convention in regards to foreign policy. What does the world look like under your administration? Do other countries expand if America is pulling back? What type of wars are you interested in if you're not in regime change wars? There's so many questions that you can ask somebody with a foreign policy that runs off kilter, but instead, you don't get that. You get, are you an Assad apologist? Are you trying to help Assad? Are you really a Russian asset? Are you really going to run in a third party? People getting paid millions of dollars to engage in nonsense. You can make an argument that the reason they get that $1 million is to engage in that very nonsense. This is 93.9 FM The Work. My name is Jamarl Thomas. We're coming up 15 minutes left in the show. If you guys want to call in, the number is 804-464-1089, 804-464-1089.
Network.
See, I was trying to get folks to know what's going on because I was like, I want to do my show live. I like it. Yeah. And it's like, how do you get that edited feel over something like that?
Your wish is an answer. Hang on a second.
Welcome to
Hello.
WRWK 93.9 FM. We're accepting calls now. Apparently, we do have a call.
You see Mo?
Let's see.
Mojo.
Mojo. Where's Mojo from?
This is Ron. So you are going on there?
So let's see. We have a caller.
Okay.
Apparently, the name is Mojo. All right, Mojo.
Black politics. All right. Hang on a second. You'll hear the station and then you'll hear him. And it's Stan.
How's it going, Mojo? Mojo, can you hear me?
He doesn't hear you. Well, you might have.
What's going on, man? How's it going?
Not bad at all. Not bad at all, man. I appreciate you showing me you got a real perspective.
Well, thank you.
Straight to the point.
I appreciate it. I have a tendency to be long-winded, but I try to get to the point at some point.
You do a good job. I think you do a good job.
Thanks, man. So what's going on? What's the topic?
So I didn't make your whole show. I just seen it because I followed you when I seen that you was live. So I missed most of it really. I just heard you say it's like 15 minutes left, and I seen the number, so I said, shit, let me try to call and talk to the brother.
No worries. No worries.
And I was thinking, so I'm one of the people who I have zero confidence in the American political system, especially when it comes to black folks.
Okay.
Us all.
And yeah.
That goes for the whites too.
You know, it's funny. Well, you said that goes for the whites too. I remember I was having a conversation with somebody, and I made the point to him. I said, you realize that half of the country is either in poverty or close to it. And they said, okay. And I said, blacks only make up 13% of the country. And they was like, what's your point? I said, whites
You're
vote,
one of us.
right, whites vote massively for Republicans, for people who are screwing them over in the same way that blacks are voting for Democrats. It's a class issue. You know, yeah, but go for it. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
My philosophy is this, okay? It's okay. My philosophy is this. I understand that American politics is bad for all Americans. All Americans. However, when we talk about black people, we're always treated as second, third, and even sometimes fourth and fifth class citizens. So if it's bad for all Americans, it's extra bad for black people.
Yeah.
And then I just hear so much like, oh, our ancestors died and bled so you could vote. And I'm like, shut the fuck up. I don't know if I can cuss.
No, you can't curse on radio. yeah. No curse on. That's only on my show, not on the radio.
You made your point.
But I'm glad you caught yourself, so thank you.
And I'm like, yeah. No, they didn't. They died and bled because they were black. And American white folks don't like black people. Not so they could vote. So stop. And then I try to explain, like, well, what is your vote doing? What are you doing after you vote? You're not paying politicians. So my question for you, and I know it's kind of off topic, and you can just say, bro, that's off topic, but I'll do a show about it, is what do you think about an actual black party? Not a green party. Like, there's several different parties, and it varies by state. And obviously the two main ones is Republican, Democrats, and I already understand that logic and everything else. But I have a different reason for us getting the black party, like, because we have the black congressional caucus, which is a bunch of BS. You know, we've had a quote unquote black president. We have all these black judges, black lawyers, and everything else. And it's like, okay, but the position of black people is literally getting worse with all this so-called progress. So what do you think about it actually being, you know what, we're going to separate from you guys' political system, and we're going to start a black party and see what happens. What is your thoughts about that? I've never talked about that.
I don't think I've ever talked about it. I'm not against any group representing their interests. Not in the least. I mean, why wouldn't groups represent their interests? And any group can bring people on. I mean, there's a S&P in Britain who the only thing they want to do is leave, and that's the only thing they talk about. We got to get out. We want to leave. We want to leave. We want our referendum. There's nothing wrong with it per se. The issue becomes this notion of political influence, right? The Democratic Party lives and dies off the black vote. Straightforward. And, there's a thing that came out in The Nation, a study, from between 34 and 49 black women, single black women on average, have a net worth of $5 as compared to the white counterpart of the same group that has $42,000 wealth. Think about that. $5. I mean, so it's not like that's extraordinary. I mean, Obama gets in office and they try to act like his blackness in and of itself would be the thing as opposed to class arguments. He gives 95% of the income gains to the top 1%. Black candidate. People still being shot. And then he goes... Oh, I love those conversations. Those conversations get me out of bed in the morning. Because, look, ultimately, they have to defend his record. You have to defend it. And I've had, talking to blacks, and they're like, hey, man, he gave this, bogus side, whatever, that was an incrementalist thing. And because of that, this is awesome. And I make the point, like, you had a guy where Flint, Michigan, let's talk Flint, Michigan at the moment. Flint, Michigan had a situation where their water was essentially putting lead in the water. And they did that because they wanted to have a cheaper decision. You had a Republican who, for the most part, like, hey, we can cut costs by doing X, and didn't take care to ensure that doing X wasn't going to have lead and all sorts of contaminants go into the population that these kids and these people were drinking. Now you have a situation where these kids grew up drinking lead and all of the things associated with it, meaning lower IQ, crime, those type of things. And this thing was specifically an issue of class. You know what I mean? Like, this wasn't, people try to make this stuff an issue of race, but the fact is, a lot of issues of race at their core are issues of class. And this was one of them. This wouldn't happen to a rich community. This happened to a poor community, a largely African-American community. When the black president came there and he got on stage and he said, let me get some water. And the African-Americans in that crowd were horrified because ultimately he was making light of something that they live on a daily basis. They have to deal with those kids that are growing up drinking lead. They have to deal with the consequences of those kids growing up drinking lead, and also knowing that the government that was supposed to be looking out for their interests weren't, including the black president that they enthusiastically and even wept when he got in office. You want to talk about betrayal. Does a black political party deal with that? Maybe. And if it does deal with those issues and it's full-throated in regards to poverty, my only hedge on something like that is because I think the main issues that avail us are issues of class. I don't like breaking us up, meaning for political force. And I think that's something that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party engages in. When you get into this notion of identity politics and you have, blacks here, Hispanics here, and these other groups here, when, in all honesty, when you look at the income distribution, you have a large share of the population that is just poor or barely making ends meet. Like 75% of the population is vulnerable in regards to whether they can feed themselves or whatnot. The number of people who are using food banks, all of these things are atrocious to live in this country. But that's across the board, meaning like that's white, black, gay, straight, Hispanic, across the board. Even though I agree with you that the issues with blacks may be more pressing. From a standpoint of getting things done, I really honestly believe that the argument is class. Let me ask you this. Would you feel that way if there was a party that dealt with issues of class? Would you feel... Oh, go ahead, I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Based on class.
Well, I guess I'm asking, if you had a party that represented class interests, this notion that the bottom, because if Sanders gets his way and you get a Medicare for all plan, that is major, especially at the lower end of the income distribution that didn't have the money to pay that stuff. Or if you get, you're not going to have a situation where 95% of the income gains go to the top 1% under Sanders. That's not going to happen at all. I mean, even if you get the college loan thing, I mean, the income the income inequality is cut dramatically. Even if you just got rid of college debt, meaning for African Americans to be able to go to school without having all this debt on their backs, that's that's an issue of class, though. That's not singular to issues of race. Even though the lower of income distribution is helped in an outsized way.
Allow me to interject in,
Go for it.
because you are 100% right that class has so much to do about it. I don't want to say everything, but so much to do about it. Class has so much to do about it. However, when you look at black folks in America, specifically American-born black folks,
Yes.
we've been placed in this position of a lower class intentionally. It's never been no you just work for your stuff and this whole idea of a meritocracy and everything. So that's why I say that when it comes to black folks,
Yeah.
specifically, and I don't take it lightly. I don't just say, oh yeah, well yeah, duh, black people got a little harder.
I don't think you do.
Talking and having a conversation.
Yeah.
Because that's very significant. It's very significant because when you say, and I know you done read articles and heard the studies about, it'll take black folks 200
Yes.
something years to even be up with black folks. Oh yeah, by the year 2053,
Yeah.
black American net income is going to be zero.
Yes.
That is very significant, and that is done by design. And that's why I'm saying, black folks have to stop BSing and start doing for themselves. Because my philosophy and my belief is that if we would say, because we are treated separate, so all of that, like we are the world stuff, that sounds great, but I call that a hypothetical reality.
Yes.
But in tangible reality, no one gives a dang about black folks. And it's been shown time and time and time and time again. So if we, quote unquote, we that don't exist, were to say, you know what, let's do our own thing. I believe that we would just get spit on even more. Like, okay, yeah, y'all got your own stuff, but we ain't gonna do nothing for y'all still. So then it'll just force us to come together and do stuff like boycott certain things. Use our two point something trillion, quote unquote, buying power and do for ourselves and stop just putting it into the system. So people will come to us. Notice you don't see Asians all on TV with vote yes and all these shirts. You don't see that. You don't see Japanese people saying, we need to vote, because they doing their own thing, so therefore the government is coming to them and saying, what do y'all need? They just paying people, while black folks is shaming people. Your ancestors died. Shame on you for not voting. It's really sick. It's really sick because there's no power behind it. Then you're gonna go and ask for reparations, that a bill that's been on Capitol Hill for 30 years that just says research reparations. It's sick. It's really sick, man. Seriously, and it is comical.
No, I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing because you're right about the bill. The bill has been there forever. and it's like, it's just to research it. It's just to research.
It's ridiculous. And they ready to fight about it and cry and no, we ADOS, no, we foundational blacks. No. They look at you like what you act like.
Wait, I'm gonna have to end it here because we're at the hour. Dude, I really do appreciate you calling in. And I don't disagree with you. I can't, I agree that political power needs to be something that we be more in line with and being not entirely stuck in the context of the Democratic Party for using it. I mean, it's neutered the moment that you stick it in the context of the Democratic Party. And I will end it. And I'll end it on that one. I appreciate you calling in, man. This is WR. Very cool. Thanks, man. This is WRWK 93.9 FM, The Work. We would leave it there. I want to thank everyone that called in and everyone who's under the sound of this particular voice, be it on my YouTube audience or the radio audience. This is Jamarl Thomas signing off.
All right, well, the irreplaceable Jamarl Thomas is gone, but I'm here to read one more announcement or two. So bear with me, folks, while I do this, and I'm going to take you off live FB feed now. Wait for the camera. Oh, that's your cue. All right, folks, what I'd like to tell you is that just like anything else, running a radio station costs money. As a community radio station, we depend on our audience and partners to contribute to our funding. Please consider becoming a supporting patron today. Your monthly or one-time gift goes a long way toward keeping WRWK, LP, FM, and free Why don't we provide space
Guys,
for the
thank you.
community to tell the story?
Brian Finley, why do you think Anna Kasparian hates Tulsi so much? It almost comes across as personal. I gotta be honest, I don't know. Wait, one second.
Or our Facebook page to donate to us through PayPal. If you go to Facebook, due to the way they configure it, you have to go to the connect option rather than the donate option. Don't know why they don't let me put donate on that button, but that's another thing. So when you go to the PayPal, if you check that little box that says make this a monthly,
I don't know what's going on with Anna Kasparian. Honestly, I don't. But she hates Gabbard. I don't particularly why. But that's not just her, right? Being at the Democratic Party also. I just kind of assume that she's in the context of the Democratic Party. I don't know. It comes across as religious weirdness, you know, like it's pathological or something. But I don't know. Not to mention a lot of it doesn't even have tether to reality. You can attack Gabbard if it's legit, but oftentimes it's not. Even Garavi, dude, thank you. Thank you. Megan Morales, why do you think Tulsi hasn't commented on Bolivia coup for her talk about regime change wars? Because it's not a war, but this regime change coup is okay with her. Good question. Megan, I don't know the answer to that, but extremely good question. This coup in Bolivia is disgusting. And I have to be honest, I can't back any candidate that can't say as much. So I'm going to end this up here, guys. Guys, thank you for showing up. Like, share, and subscribe. Thanks all.